Think you know mummification? Most people picture a single tidy scene, ancient Egyptian priests, a gold mask, maybe a dramatic curse, and then we all politely move on. But the truth is far more global, far more technical, and occasionally far more weird than the movies ever dared. People in the Atacama Desert were deliberately mummifying their dead long before Egypt's pyramids rose out of the sand. Bodies were preserved by salt mines, by bog water that tanned skin like leather, by freezing mountain air, and yes, by carefully applied resins that smelled like a pine forest, warming in the sun. And here's the part that really upends the popular image. Some of the most famous facts about Egyptian mummification, the ones we repeat confidently at dinner parties, were probably misunderstood for centuries. Even the classic story of how they removed the brain has been revised with modern scanning. History has receipts, and in this episode, some of those receipts are inside the skull. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop a comment with your time and location. It's genuinely fascinating to see this community tuning in from everywhere at once, like a very quiet, very historically curious night watch. Tonight the story is about the long human habit of refusing to let go, not in a spooky way, more in a practical, devotional, sometimes surprisingly tender way. We'll walk through an Egyptian embalming workshop where natron crystals did slow chemical work, day after day, where linen was wrapped finger by finger, and where the dead were treated with a carefulness that feels almost domestic. Then we'll widen the view. Deserts, ice fields, peat bogs, salt mines, and sealed tombs that accidentally created their own little climates. And later, I'll bring us back to the modern world, where mummies become evidence in court cases, subjects in CT scanners, and sometimes the center of fierce debates about who has the right to keep an ancestor on a shelf. Along the way, we'll meet a nosy Greek traveler who thought he understood everything, a Victorian crowd that treated archaeology like entertainment, and a few scientists who discovered that the best way to learn from the dead is often to leave them very much alone. The word mummy itself carried a misunderstanding for a long time. It came into English through medieval Latin and Arabic, connected not just to preserved bodies, but to a substance called mumia, a dark bitumen-like material. In medieval and early modern Europe, mumia became a commodity. People ground up what they believed were mummies and sold the powder as medicine. If that makes you blink awake for a moment, you're not alone. It is one of those historical facts that sounds like a prank, but it was real, and it turned preserved bodies into trade goods, sometimes without anyone caring whose body it had been. In a broad sense, a mummy is simply a body preserved beyond the usual pace of decay. Sometimes humans did it on purpose, with craft and ritual. Sometimes the environment did it all by itself. Extreme dryness, bitter cold, acidic bogs with low oxygen, or salt so concentrated it pulled moisture straight out of tissue. Scholars often divide them into deliberate mummies and natural mummies, but the line can blur. A society might place a body in a place that naturally preserves it, and add a little ritual preparation on top, like giving nature a helpful nudge. If we start with the widest possible view, mummies have been found on every continent. That alone should challenge the idea that mummification is an Egyptian thing, like pyramids or hieroglyphs. Egypt was extraordinary, yes, but it wasn't alone. The human problem was universal. A body decays, and decay is loud in the mind, even when it's quiet in the earth. Many cultures answered that problem with preservation, not always out of fear, sometimes out of love, status, theology, or simply the need to keep someone close for a while. In the Atacama Desert on the Pacific coast of South America, The Chinchorro people practiced deliberate mummification beginning in the 5th millennium BCE, thousands of years before the most elaborate Egyptian embalming became common. Their work could be astonishingly complex. In some cases, they removed organs. In some, they removed skin, reinforced the body, rebuilt it with plant fibers and clay, then painted it in vivid pigments, red or black, creating a figure that looked less like a corpse and more like an intensely cared-for sculpture. What's especially striking is that Chinchorro mummification did not seem restricted to kings. Infants and adults alike could receive the same elaborate attention. If Egypt sometimes treated preservation as a luxury service with pricing tiers, Chinchorro culture often treated it more like a communal responsibility. But here's the part that will surprise you if you've only ever seen museum posters of pharaohs. Egypt's earliest mummies may have started as accidents. In prehistoric burials, bodies laid in shallow pits in dry sand, and the desert did what deserts do. Moisture vanished, microbes struggled, skin tightened, hair remained, and the human outline endured. Later, as burial practices changed and people began using coffins and tombs that kept bodies away from direct sand contact, that accidental preservation decreased. And that may have pushed Egyptians toward deliberate techniques, as if the environment had once provided a free service, then quietly stopped. By the Old Kingdom, and certainly by the 4th and 5th dynasties around 2600 BCE, embalming had become more systematic, and recent chemical analyses suggest deliberate embalming substances might have been used earlier than that, with evidence from a linen-wrapped specimen in Turin dated to roughly 5,600 years ago, showing conifer resin and plant extracts. That matters because it suggests experimentation, people learning what resins did to flesh, how cloth held shape, how scent and chemistry could cooperate. Now imagine an embalming workshop in Egypt, not as a horror set, but as a place of work. The air would have held competing smells: sharp natron salt, sweet and resinous oils, perhaps palm wine used in cleansing. Linen lay in stacks, torn into long strips. Hands moved with practiced economy, the way a good baker folds dough or a skilled tailor measures without needing to look twice. There were priests involved, because this was never only technical. It was ritual labor, the kind that tried to make the invisible world behave properly. Egyptian belief divided the person into several aspects. The Ka was a kind of life force, or double that needed sustenance, offerings, continuity. The Ba was mobile, able to leave the tomb and return, often depicted like a human-headed bird. The Akh was the transformed effective spirit, the end state you hoped to reach. The body mattered because it anchored identity. You might think of the mummy as a container, but in Egyptian thought it was more like an address. Without the address, how would the soul know where to come home? The process, especially in the New Kingdom when the craft reached its most refined forms, moved through stages that were both slow and meticulous. Sources often speak of 70 days, a number associated with ritual cycles and recorded by Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. But other evidence points to a 40-day dehydration phase within a longer overall program. The practical truth is likely flexible. Bodies vary, seasons vary, and even sacred industries have to adjust to reality. If you've ever tried to follow a recipe exactly and discovered your oven has its own personality, you can sympathize with an ancient embalmer staring at a damp elbow and realizing the schedule is an aspiration. First came cleansing, washing the body, purifying it, preparing it. Then the internal work, because organs decay quickly. The abdominal incision was typically made on the left side. Organs were removed and treated. In earlier periods, they might be stored in canopic jars, each one associated with protective deities. In later periods, some organs were treated and returned to the body, while canopic jars remained as ritual symbols even if their practical role had changed. The heart, importantly, was usually left in place because it was considered the seat of intellect and identity, crucial for judgment in the afterlife. And then there was the brain. For a long time, people imagined embalmers pulling it out with an iron hook, the way Herodotus described. It's a vivid image, and vivid images have a way of becoming fact, even when they're only partly true. But modern CT scans have shown something subtler. Evidence suggests embalmers inserted a tool through the nasal passage to break down brain tissue, essentially macerating it so it could liquefy and drain. In at least one case, an organic rod was found within a cranial cavity, supporting the idea that the goal was not to fish for chunks, but to turn the brain into something gravity could handle. It's less dramatic than the hook, but more plausible and also oddly relatable. Ancient people, like modern people, preferred a method that worked. Once the body was emptied and cleaned, dehydration began. Natron, a naturally occurring mixture of salts found in Egypt, was the star here. It was packed inside the body cavities, and the body could be covered with it as well. Natron crystals drew moisture out slowly, relentlessly, as if the body were a landscape and the water were receding like a tide. Over days and weeks, skin tightened, tissues dried, and the smell of decay was held back. There's something almost quiet about that stage. Not much to see. A body lying still, surrounded by salt, time doing the heavy lifting. If you walked past, you might hear nothing but the faint scratch of linen being prepared nearby, or the soft murmur of someone reciting a formula they'd said 100 times. The work was not only in the hands, but in the waiting. And waiting is a kind of labor humans have always struggled to respect. After dehydration, the restoration began. A dried body can look harsh, collapsed. Embalmers padded sunken areas with linen or other stuffing. They could insert false eyes to restore a lifelike gaze. They anointed the skin with oils and resins, and warmed resins might be brushed or poured to seal and protect, giving the surface a faint sheen and a lingering scent. Those resins were not only symbolic, they were practical, creating a barrier against moisture and microbes. And they were cosmological too, anointing as rebirth, preservation as transformation. Then wrapping, the stage that most of us picture but rarely imagine in detail. Linen strips, sometimes hundreds of yards in total for high-status individuals, laid on in layers. Fingers could be wrapped individually, then the hand, then the forearm, building outward like careful architecture. Amulets were placed between layers, each one a protective instruction. The wrapping wasn't just covering, it was construction. A new body made of cloth and intention. If you want a detail that makes the whole thing feel suddenly real, imagine the texture of linen, not silky, but firm, slightly rough, the weave catching on dry skin if you're not careful. Imagine the warmth of resin on fingertips, sticky at first, then setting. Imagine the steady rhythm of a workshop where multiple sets of hands know exactly what to do next. In modern terms, it was a combination of religious ceremony and highly specialized service industry, which is another reminder that humans have always been humans. If something matters, we build a profession around it. Not everyone in Egypt received the same level of care. Herodotus described 3 methods, essentially 3 price points. The most perfect method was elaborate and expensive. A middle method used cedar oil in a way meant to reduce labor and cost. The simplest method involved cleansing and natron with fewer interventions. Even without fully trusting every detail in Herodotus, the basic truth stands. Mummification was stratified. Death was universal, but embalming was, often, a purchase. And then there were animals. If your mental image of Egypt includes one solemn sarcophagus, it may not include 1,000,000 cats. But ancient Egypt produced enormous numbers of animal mummies. Cats associated with Bastet, ibises with Thoth, crocodiles with Sobek, and sacred bulls like the Apis bull, which received elaborate burial in dedicated cemeteries such as those at Saqqara. Some animals were cult animals, treated with care as manifestations of the divine. Others were votive offerings, produced in astonishing volume for pilgrims. It was devotion, yes, but it was also economy, breeding, workshops, distribution, temple networks. Religion has always had supply chains. If we widen the lens again, the variety of natural mummification reads like a tour of extreme environments. In northern Europe, peat bogs created a different kind of preservation. Bogs were acidic, low in oxygen, often cold, and they could tan skin, turning it dark and leathery, while sometimes dissolving bone. Tolland man, found in Denmark, had a face so intact that he looked like he might sigh and open his eyes. Bog bodies sometimes preserved stomach contents, giving archaeologists a last meal, a final menu item from 2,000 years ago. It's intimate in a way that feels almost unfair, like reading someone's diary when they never offered it. In the Alps, ice did what natron did in another language. Otzi the Iceman, dating to about 5,300 years ago, lay preserved by cold. His clothing, tools, and body told stories. What he ate, how he moved, the wounds he carried. And in a detail that makes the past feel uncomfortably close, genetic research has identified living relatives of Otzi in modern populations. Imagine that. Your distant cousin from prehistory, still showing up at family reunions in the form of a scientific paper. In Iran, at the Cherabad salt mine, saltmen were preserved by high salinity. Salt drew moisture away and inhibited microbial growth. Some remains dated to around 400 BCE, associated with mining activity and likely accidents, perhaps a collapse. The salt preserved not just flesh, but textiles, turning a workplace disaster into an archaeological time capsule. It's one of those cases where preservation is almost rude in its thoroughness, like the earth refusing to let a story be forgotten. In the Andes, the cold and dryness of high mountain summits preserved Inca sacrificial victims, including the famous finds at Lulailaco, discovered in 1999. The preservation was so strong that hair and clothing survived in remarkable condition, and hair, inconveniently for anyone hoping to keep rituals mysterious, holds chemistry. Analyses showed increased coca and alcohol consumption in the months before death, suggesting careful ritual preparation. It's a grim fact, but it also reveals planning, structure, and the human tendency to choreograph meaning into even the hardest moments. Now, you might be thinking mummification is always either a high-tech sacred process or an environmental accident. But there's a third category that deserves attention: preservation, that happens because humans build spaces that create their own climate. In European crypts, some bodies naturally desiccated because of airflow patterns, humidity control, and architecture. Places like the Capuchin catacombs of Palermo became sites where the dead were displayed, dressed, and arranged. It could be a social statement. Look, our family remains present. It's not so far from keeping a portrait on the wall, just taken to its most literal extreme. And it reminds us that the urge to display the dead, to make them part of the living world, is not confined to any one religion or continent. you can feel a pattern emerging. Preservation is chemistry, yes, but it's also relationship. Who gets preserved, how, and where tells you what a society valued, feared, or wanted to keep close. But wait, it gets even weirder, because the story of mummification is not only ancient, it also has a long afterlife in modern curiosity, commerce, and science. In the 19th century, mummies became entertainment in parts of Europe and North America. People held unwrapping parties where a mummy was treated like a theatrical prop. You can imagine the scene: a drawing room, polite chatter, someone pretending this is education, and beneath the manners, a profound disrespect. It's hard to defend, and we shouldn't try, but it's historically important because it shaped how museums collected, how the public imagined Egypt, and how many remains were separated from their contexts, stripped of the information that would have told their true stories. And that brings us to a secondary character in this saga, arriving right on schedule like someone who always thinks he's the first person to notice anything. Herodotus. Writing in the 5th century BCE, he offered one of the earliest detailed descriptions of Egyptian embalming. He was curious, observant, and also, like many travelers, confident in a way that can outpace accuracy. His account of different mummification methods is invaluable, but it's also a reminder that even ancient sources were already interpreting, summarizing, and sometimes misunderstanding. The irony is delicious in a gentle way. For centuries, modern people treated Herodotus as the authority on mummification, only for modern imaging to show that the embalmers were doing something slightly different inside the skull than he seemed to think. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and the tone began to change. In 1903, radiographic studies by researchers including Grafton Elliott Smith and work involving Howard Carter showed that X-rays could look inside a mummy without unwrapping it. That sounds obvious now, but at the time it was revolutionary. It meant you could preserve the wrappings, the amulets, the layers of meaning, and still learn about bones, injuries, and technique. Later, CT scanning took this further, allowing digital unwrapping, three-dimensional reconstructions, and virtual autopsies. It's one of history's more satisfying plot twists. The best way to see inside a mummy turned out to be leaving it intact. You're probably thinking the big revelations are all about Egypt because Egypt left such a deep record. But actually, modern science has made global mummy studies explode in complexity. Stable isotopes in hair and bone can show diet and mobility. Radiocarbon dating secures chronologies. Ancient DNA can reveal kinship and population connections, and it can also change legal outcomes. A striking example is the Spirit Cave individual from Nevada, discovered in 1940 and dated to roughly 9,400 years before present. For decades, arguments swirled about ancestry and affiliation. Genomic analyses eventually showed strong links to modern indigenous populations, supporting repatriation. That case wasn't just a scientific milestone. It was a reminder that mummies and preserved bodies are not only specimens. They can be ancestors with living descendants who have rights, responsibilities, and grief. At this point in the story, we arrive at the central conflict, the one that has been quietly building underneath every fascinating detail. Preservation keeps bodies from disappearing, but it also keeps them available. And availability invites ownership questions, profit motives, and moral mistakes. If you can preserve a body, you can also steal it. You can sell it. You can grind it into medicine, as happened with mumia in Europe. You can display it as a curiosity. You can remove it from the place and people who consider it sacred, and then act surprised when they object. The problem isn't only ancient. It's modern and ongoing. Museums and collectors in the 19th and early 20th centuries often obtained mummified remains with poor documentation, sometimes through outright looting. Context was lost. Names, tomb inscriptions, grave goods, the local stories that would have made a body more than a body. And when context is gone, it's easy to treat remains as objects rather than persons. Even when intentions improved, new problems appeared. Excavation and exposure can damage mummies. Tombs and crypts that kept a stable microclimate for centuries suddenly meet modern air, modern humidity, modern fungi. Microbial communities wake up. Some fungi, including species like Aspergillus niger, can threaten both the remains and the health of researchers. Conservation becomes urgent, expensive, and imperfect. Imagine spending 2,000 years in a carefully sealed environment only to have your worst day be the day you become famous. And then there are the modern political and cultural disputes. The Siberian ice maiden, found on the Ukok Plateau in 1993, became a focal point for debates between scientific institutions and local Altai communities who saw the remains as belonging to their heritage and identity. Similar tensions appear around Maori mokomokai, preserved tattooed heads that were traded during colonial periods and are now being repatriated from European museums. These are not academic arguments. They touch identity, history, and the right to decide what happens to the dead. If this happened today in an ordinary family, it would be unthinkable. Imagine your ancestor displayed behind glass in another country with a little placard summarizing their life in 3 sentences, one of which is probably wrong. You wouldn't call that education. You'd call it theft with better lighting. So what did people do once the problem became impossible to ignore? How do you balance learning from the past with respecting the dead and respecting the living communities connected to them? The resolution, imperfect but real, has come through a combination of better tools and better ethics. The tools matter because they reduce harm. CT scanning, radiography, and 3-dimensional reconstruction allow researchers to learn without unwrapping, cutting, or sampling more than necessary. Digital unwrapping can reveal amulets placed among bandages, fractures in bone, even embalming tools or materials left behind. It can show whether the heart remains, how the organs were treated, and yes, it can help settle arguments that began with Herodotus. Experimental archaeology has also helped, not as spectacle, but as a way to test plausibility. Researchers like Bob Breyer and Ronald Wade demonstrated practical aspects of embalming, showing what methods could work and which were more likely literary embellishments. Combined with chemical analyses identifying resins and oils, the picture becomes less mythical and more human. A craft learned through experience, refined through tradition. The ethical side matters just as much. Laws and policies, such as repatriation frameworks in the United States, have shifted the balance of power toward descendant communities. Consultation is increasingly standard. Some institutions have changed how they display human remains, adding context, seeking consent when possible, or choosing not to display at all. Repatriation of mokomokai to iwi in New Zealand is an example of museums acknowledging past wrongs and trying to repair them. The Spirit Cave case showed that science can support repatriation rather than oppose it when the question is approached with humility and care. Even the language is changing. Many researchers emphasize that mummies are not just data. They are people caught between worlds. The world that made them and the world that found them. In a way, this returns us to the oldest truth behind mummification. The entire practice began because people believed the dead mattered. Whether it was an Egyptian family paying for linen and resin, Chinchorro artisans rebuilding a body with clay and pigment, Inca priests placing offerings on a frozen summit, or a modern community requesting the return of an ancestor, the underlying impulse is the same. The dead are not nothing. And perhaps the most satisfying irony of all is that modern science, often accused of being cold, has pushed mummy studies toward gentler methods. We learned to see more by touching less. We learned that the hook story wasn't quite right, and that the real story inside the skull was stranger, quieter, and more practical. We learned that a mummy can teach us about trade networks through resins, about diet through isotopes, about kinship through DNA, and about ourselves through the uncomfortable history of how we treated the preserved dead. The next time you see a mummy in a museum, it's worth remembering that you're looking at several stories layered together. There's the ancient story of belief and technique, the environmental story of salt or sand or ice, the modern story of discovery and science, and the moral story we're still writing about respect, ownership, and responsibility. Thanks for spending this time with the long, global history of mummification. And if you haven't yet, I still love hearing where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there, so feel free to leave your time and location in the comments. In the next episode, we'll step into another corner of the past where ordinary human habits produced extraordinary history.